Greetings, and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tao. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerers Guild. Today on Magical Theory and Cryptid Tales, we are going to be talking about shadow magic and beginning a series on shadow magic with a crossover episode into Cryptid Tales, where we talk not only about shadow people, but also the hatman and the shadow realm itself. Okay, so to begin that discussion, we're actually going to begin with the shadow realm and a bit on shadow magic, and then we will go into the denizens of the shadow realm, including shadow people and how they can be formed, and then we will end with a discussion on the hatman and what that has to do with us as sorcerers. Okay, so the first thing we'll talk about then, like I said, is the shadow realm, and I want to begin that with a discussion on secrecy. Now, the realm of shadow is a realm of secrecy. I said in a previous video that the death realm is the realm that is an echo of that which has come before and already come to pass. With the shadow realm, we are dealing with that which has remained unseen. And although we are talking about a spectrum between light and dark, we are also talking about mystery and the unknown when we are talking about the shadow realm. Okay, and we are not, however, talking about shadow work like in Jungian psychology. There is a lot of great stuff to be done with shadow work. We're not necessarily talking about psychology here when we are talking about shadow magic. We are talking about the shadow realm, which literally exists within these shadows around us. All the varying degrees of light. Within every varying degree of light and darkness, there is shadow. In fact, from the perspective of the shadow realm, there is no light nor dark, only varying degrees of shadow. Because no matter how bright a light shines, no matter how brightly it shines, all it is doing is increasing its potential to create shadow. Because any variation within that light is shadow. And the darkness, although it travels faster than light, can only move through shadow. Okay, so as I said, the shadow realm is a realm of secrecy and hidden things, but it is also something very close to the material plane and observable. Shadow is all around us within the light spectrum. And another thing that we want to understand with this, to understand this paradigm correctly, you need to grasp the difference between white and black as colors, and light and dark as on another spectrum. There is some interesting metaphors between them, but they are very much different things. White is the potential for all colors, while dark is black is the culmination of all colors. And while there is some correlation there with the metaphor of light being the entrance of light and that sheds vision, and the darkness being the absence of that, perhaps there's maybe some metaphoric correlation there, but in the end those are very different things. Yeah. Okay, so the darkness, as we were just discussing, is absence. Darkness is the absence of light. And when we get to the point that we have absolute darkness, that is, there is no light at all, and this is a form of lack. So the darkness is one of those things that is closest to the void, or to the nothing, as I talk about in previous videos. Sometimes we often think of the void as that thing which is closest to the nothing, the ultimate absence that is there right on the edge of nothing. But darkness is there as well. And it is in that darkness that shadow begins its creation. It is that connection to the darkness that we begin that creation. It is in shadows. We often see many things in shadows, often with our minds, and we'll get to that in just a moment, because that's where we begin the discussion on shadow people. But in the flickering of shadows, in the flickering of lights, that we find the realm of shadows, the indistinguishable forms and shapes that flit between one thing and the next. It is there that we find the mystery and strangeness that is shadow. Yeah? Okay, so that's enough about the shadow realm in particular for now. So, I said we will get into the denizens of the shadow realm. And like I said, there is that edge of the nothing aspect to the shadow, because it is lack that creates. It is lack of light that creates shadow. It is an absence of energy, and it is in that absence that we can draw from the nothing and create anything that our mind imagines. And there are many different shapes and creatures and forms that exist within the realm of shadow. And that's how they begin, is by a form being perceived within that shadow and held long enough that it begins to take on an awareness of its own. Shadows are a lot like servitors, only some of these shadows have existed forever. These are spontaneously generated beings that come out of the darkness. And that's another one we want to get out of the way right here, because I just realized how creepy that might sound to some of you. There is no correlation at all between light and dark and good and evil. In fact, within the shadows, there is mystery. There is obscurity. There isn't necessarily a morality involved with shadow magic, except for your own honor and your own word and reputation. Like I was talking about in previous videos about the power of one's word and reputation. That's the only morality that is within the shadow realm. Yeah, because this is the hidden. These are the things that you can only you know your true self. But you still have, there is still that idea that if you don't hold to your character and hold to your honor, that you are loosening the cohesion of your form. And, well, like I said then, the more you, the less you show value to your word, the less value your word has. Yeah. So there's a big difference between understanding the value of secrecy and telling lies as well. But anyways, we'll continue on from here. So, shadow people are beings that are one of the most spontaneously generated creatures of the shadow realm. These are things that just pop up. And that's why they're often found around certain houses where the people don't sleep a lot. Yeah? Is because, well, their mind holds on to things long enough. They see shapes in the shadows. And once they see these shapes and hold on to them, they are given form in the shadow realm. And so then you have these shadow beings skittering about, often having no self-awareness at all, and simply just, well, spontaneously generated servitors with no clear intent, essentially. And there are many other beings that exist in the shadow realm, but that's all the shadow people really are. There are people that work with shadow magic that have given these beings names, but they're small things. And they're not always human shapes. Yeah, they're not always humanoid. Sometimes you'll see cats, dogs, whatever it is that the mind turns these things into. And I'm not saying they're just in your head. I'm saying that the shadow realm is right next to and on the edge of the nothing. And when we imagine things into the nothing, we create things. And so it is with shadow. Yeah. Now, before I get more into that idea that we were just getting to there, I want to talk a little bit more about some of these other denizens of the shadow realm. Because some of these beings, once they form, eventually do develop self-awareness. And we'll be getting to some of those here in just a bit, and why I brought the realm of death mentioned into this as well. Okay, so anyways, one of the most common among these, of course, is shadow cats. And these can be seen quite often, especially in those that work with shadow magic. These are one of the things that may come to you, is you will see the shadow of a cat moving about. In fact, I seen one not long ago that was part of the reason I began thinking more about doing these videos and about actually seeking the permissions to do so. Anyways, there is also shadow people that have existed over time, and we begin talking, but that's when we're going to be getting into the hatman. So we'll get into that in just a moment. Let's not quite get to that, because they are going to get their own little area. Anyways, so we have cats, we have birds, dogs. It is hard to say what shape these shadows will take, but there is a more distinct cohesion with the ones that are older. And the older a shadow being is, the more self-aware it becomes, the more cohesive it becomes, or breaks apart. If it manages not to break apart and create its own cohesion, then the older it gets, the more powerful and intelligent it will become. So anytime then that we are dealing with a denizen of the shadow realm that we are able to actually make deals with, by the time it has gained that amount of cohesion within itself, it is very much a self-aware, independent being that we need to treat with reciprocity and respect. And that's why I actually came back to the idea of keeping one's word and the value of one's word, because that is the only authority these types of beings respect, is one's personal honor and the value of one's words. And that is why any beings that in the shadow realm that you make deals with, you need to keep the deals that you make and keep your word with these beings, because they will respond very negatively if you do not. And these are beings that exist in a liminal space of the shadow realm. So whether you choose to fear them or not, they are not something that is easily escaped. And like I was saying before, when we are dealing with them, they are very useful in acquiring information and making deals with them, but they are often going to be little things that they even if it's just to test you. They like to keep that mystery. So there's probably going to be some deals of secrecy made between you. Now, another part of this is that, especially early on, when these shadows are forming, that is why you always see them out of the corner of your eyes, because until they grow in form, they can be broken apart simply by being over scrutinized. So if you are being attacked by shadow beings, all you really need to do is force your perception on them. And if they are small and early, that's really all it takes, is to look directly at them or acknowledge their presence. And if they are not yet self-aware, then they will break apart. And that is, like I said, why we see these things out of the corner of the eye, because they are created. The fact that they are created by perception makes them very vulnerable to perception until they gain that self-awareness and begin perceiving on their own. Okay. And then they're not actually vulnerable to that perception, but they do tend to be things that even after that they don't like to be directly seen until they are very comfortable with that idea. So, when we are dealing with these types of beings, like most spirits, they are likely to respond to alcohol and tobacco, but also roses and rose petals are very significant to the shadow realm community, if you want to call it that. Okay, so before we pass over then into the discussion on the hatman and the one who wears a hat, at least with the paradigm of shadow magic that I work with, there is a particular totem animal that I associate with the shadow realm, and that is the black hare. And the black hare is going to be being discussed quite a bit throughout this series on shadow magic, as well as tortoises when we get into the Ufu and Wanga part of this discussion, which may be coming up after this one. I haven't decided exactly which part we're going to cover next. It depends on where we flow from this. So, there is the black hare and the tortoise, which are both, in a ways, totems of the shadow realm. Okay, so the hatman. The hatman is actually a misunderstanding of what is going on here. There is no hat man. It is less of a being, and it is actually more of a role. A hatman, then, being someone who handles these shadows as they develop into self-aware beings, or even creates them. And actually, anyone, once they have access into the shadow realm, can begin creating servitors within the shadow realm. And it's as easy as perceiving a form out of shadow, or even casting shadows on a wall. I'm not going to be able to do that right now, but literally just casting a hand puppet on the wall in the form of whatever form you want. That's why the bunny, actually. I mentioned that the black hare is one of the totems for the type of shadow magic that I work with. And part of the reason that it was chosen was because making the shadow puppet of a black hare on the wall was a very simple process. It's a very easy thing to form. And from there, we can create a servitor and release it into the shadows to go and perform its work. Yeah? Anyways, the hatman is someone who works with shadow magic, essentially. And the more we learn to access this shadow realm, the more we are becoming and accessing this role. So, the hatman is the one who wears a hat, the one who works with this shadow magic. And that's what the hat is for. And that's part of the reason that I wear a hat is for working with this type of magic. There are a few more things that we will talk about with assuming this role and how we can use it to divine magic from shadows, and how we can learn to tell what is going on other places, not only when working with denizens, like I mentioned earlier, but directly through perceiving through shadow and moving within shadow, because that is a big part of what is going on here, of course, when we work with shadows. Isn't just the creation of a new form of servitor that can move in an environment, but it is the art of creating secrecy. It is the art of being able to move unseen and that sort of thing. And this series will be continuing throughout the year. But part of what we're doing here isn't just discussing the hatman, but learning to assume that role. And so that is very much what this has to do with us as sorcerers, is that in order to work with shadow magic, there are a few things that we will need. First amongst those is a hat that is designated for that purpose. The top hat is one that is often associated with the with the hatman, but it doesn't have to be a top hat. I have a video I've already done on the importance of a hat and the of a good hat and the acts of haberdashery. I'll go ahead and leave a link for that, because if you're going to be doing this, I very much suggest making your own hat, but it's not absolutely necessary. You could just get a hat, even a ball cap, attach something to it to specifically keep it to be your own hat, and then you will also need a stick. In relation to the dream, this is, I suppose, has some relation to the dream staff that we were working on before. This is a new paradigm shift that I'm working on, so we will be going through this, but it doesn't mean that any of the things that I have talked about in the past, like with the chorus, we are going to still continue on with the chorus and some of that sigil work. So just because I'm entering into this new paradigm, I just want to make clear that it doesn't mean that any of the old sigils that we use for the dream platforms and all that stuff is still going to be maintained and functioning. I am just going to be entering into this shadow paradigm for a while as we explore this area and have discussions on this type of magic. Okay, so let's see here. We've talked about the shadow realm, a little bit about what it is. We will get into more depth on that in the future, as well as more specific denizens in the shadow realm, and a little more specifics on how to create shadow people that have specific intents. We got into a little bit to that today, but we're going to get into that more. The importance of I mentioned a bit about roses, but we're going to get more into the importance of roses in the future, and we're not just talking about the petals, but the thorns as well, and of course we'll be talking more about the black hair and the tortoise. And then of course we got into the fact that the hatman is just a role, and often when we see these people that are involved with the sleep paralysis, well, they're there to gather those beings that you're creating as you're struggling with that sleep paralysis. That's why we often see these shadow people when we're having sleep paralysis, is because we are in a place of confusion and mystery. and we begin imagining forms. Yeah? And then those forms take shape into these shadow people. And then the hatman can show up to begin gathering these things that you've created. Sometimes I'll help you out of it. Sometimes they'd rather you stayed there. I'm not saying necessarily all hatmen, or hat people, I suppose we should be saying, are all those that wear a hat are not necessarily moral beings. Yeah, they may leave you in that state and harvest from you. And that's why it's important to know how to pull yourself out of sleep paralysis. But they don't actually put you there. Neither do these shadow people. And most of the time, they're actually there to help break you out of it, as far as the hatman. But I will leave a video on how to break out of sleep paralysis using a personal sigil here. Now, with sleep paralysis, of course, this shadow people thing isn't the only possibility. Sometimes there is something there creating that, and it can be a hatman that is getting you in that state so that they can harvest shadow people off of you. But there are other forms of hagging, like we've talked about in the other videos, like through vampiracy. But either way, the personal sigil will work. And to be clear, one does not have to put other people in a state of sleep paralysis to create shadow people, especially a person that began as a human being and is alive and has their own state of perception with which to perceive into the shadows. Yeah, these hatmen that are locking you into that are either people that don't understand the concept and have they're misusing the idea in a way, because, well, you're actually creating more powerful shadow people with your own mind when you understand the process. So it's not a good way to go about it anyways. And so, morality aside, moral implications aside, it is not the best way to go about things. And we're not going to be doing any discussions on that, most likely, during this series. But I did want to point out that that is not the only reason that one could be being hagged. This is something that will often happen when one is stuck in that state of sleep paralysis, simply because their soul is not realigning with their body properly as they're waking up, and it leaves you in a state of paralysis momentarily. And in that state, you then begin perceiving into the mystery on the edge of the nothing, into the shadow realm, and creating these shadow people. So they're not feeding off of you, they're being generated by your state. Okay. So that's it then. Thank you once again for joining us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. Until next time, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.